Okay, so I think we can get started. My name is Elizabeth Pendergrass, and I'd like to welcome all of you to today's webinar, Avoiding Disaster in IT Outsourcing, a Quantitative Solution for Vendor Management. Before I get started, I'd like to make you all aware of a few technical items. All of you who are listening on the conference call are currently on mute. So to ask a question at any point during the presentation, just use the Q&A dialog box shown on the right-hand side of the WebEx screen. Joe will field as many of these questions as he has time for at the end of the presentation. And if he doesn't get a chance to answer your question, don't worry, he'll respond to all of these via email. And he'll also provide his contact information for any further questions you might have after the presentation. So I'll start by quickly introducing our presenter today, Joseph Madden. Joe Madden currently leads the QSM Consulting Division, which has grown dramatically in the past 6 years and offers a wide range of professional services. These include the Software Estimation Center of Excellence, Function Point Analysis, Program and Portfolio Management, Independent Verification and Validation, Vendor Management, Benchmarking and Process Improvement, and Expert Witness Services. A longtime client of the QSM Tool Suite and co-author of the book, IT Measurement, Practical Advice from the Experts, Joe has more than 23 years of experience in IT management and consulting. So without further ado, I'll let Joe get started.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you everyone for taking some time out of your busy day to hear about our quantitative vendor management solution. Our solution includes 4 major lanes of activity, which I'll be describing in more detail. They are price and technical evaluation of vendor bids, post-award vendor monitoring and control, and assessments of O&M staffing levels on IT outsourcing contracts. At the end of the presentation, we'll provide a couple of ROI case study examples so you can see how this is applied in real client environments. So if you're a customer purchasing IT services and you've experienced any of the pain points on this slide, you've definitely come to the right webinar. All of these pain points increase risk to the organization. Cost overruns and vendor overcharging, of course, have a financial impact and may mean that other important projects don't get funded. Schedule delays or projects that fail to complete altogether, they can also lead to business disruption or even regulatory and compliance issues if that software is intended to address something in that area. And then also delivery of poor quality software increases O&M costs, and it can also increase the risk of security vulnerabilities. The more defects and technical debt you have in deployed software in production, the more potential security holes there are going to be. So lots of potential impact from these pain points. If you're a vendor, you may have experienced these pain points. And you've also come to the right webinar. It's certainly not fair when a vendor submitting a responsible cost proposal based on a realistic estimate loses to a lowball bidder who's just trying to get in the door. It's also very frustrating when a technically superior vendor with an impeccable past performance history loses to a technically inferior vendor simply because they hired a great proposal writer. It's also not fair when a vendor is cornered into a no-win death march project because the client has unrealistic expectations regarding schedule and or cost. And then finally, it's often frustrating for a vendor to inherit O&M responsibility for deployed application or suite of applications with high technical debt that was poorly developed by the previous vendor, and sometimes with very little documentation. So there are definitely pain points on the vendor side as well that we want to try to address. So our goal is to align the interests of vendors and purchasers for a win-win outcome. Purchasers, of course, are seeking the best value, a high-quality product delivered on time and within budget. Vendors are seeking maximum revenue from repeat business based on high customer satisfaction. And of course, they're concerned about having a good reputation. So in order to achieve this win-win outcome, we need to use quantitative measures against the triple constraint of project management, which you may be familiar with. Cost, on one, effort and cost on one side of the pyramid or triple constraint, schedule and quality, schedule, and then quality and functionality. So the desired outcomes typically consist on the cost side, no requested contract mods due to lowball bids or bad estimates. On the schedule side, of course, you want a predictable delivery schedule that compares favorably with industry data and client history. And on the quality functionality side, you want required functionality delivered successfully into the production environment with few defects. You also want low technical debt in the source code and documentation, which reduces and minimizes O&M costs. And then, of course, ultimately you want high stakeholder satisfaction, which, good quality and predictable delivery certainly, contributes to that. So here's a high-level view of how we apply these quantitative measures as part of the acquisition process. During pre-acquisition planning, it's important to thoroughly quantify the size and scope of the project and the required functionality. It's also, this is a good time to perform an independent cost and schedule estimate using an estimation tool to leverage historical data from completed projects. Then, as part of the request for proposal, it's important to ensure a clear RFP so vendors know what they're bidding on, including quantifying the required functionality. It's important to set realistic schedule expectations, if there are constraints. And probably most importantly, requiring the vendor to report regular status metrics as part of their status report. And we'll get into this more on how we can track vendors post-award. Then, as part of assessing vendor bids, our method allows for comparing vendor proposals not only with the independent internal estimate, but also with industry trend lines and client history. Then post-award, what we want to do is using the regular status metrics that are provided as part of routine status reports to track actual product construction and defects and run a forecast to complete. And we'll get into that in more detail as well. This next slide has an overview of how we apply the quantitative vendor management solution across the software development lifecycle. And it's important to note that our techniques work equally well regardless of whether the project is a legacy enhancement project to a legacy enhancement to a mainframe system or a cutting-edge cloud-based solution using agile methods. Irregardless, what we've found after collecting a benchmark database of over 10,000 projects is that all projects, regardless of lifecycle methodology, follow 4 generic phases. They are the initiation phase, which is simply deciding if you're going to do a project. So you might do an alternatives analysis, for example, in this phase. The elaboration phase, where you decide what needs to be done and how to do it. The construction phase, where you're building and testing a system or configuring and testing a system if it's a COTS ERP project. And this could involve multiple sprints or iterations depending on the lifecycle methodology. And then the final phase, transition, is when you're cleaning up defects and transitioning to an O&M environment. So this slide here shows how we apply our solution. The first 2 phases are typically when we'll do an independent estimate and support writing the RFP and evaluation of vendor bids. Then it's usually during the construction phase that we're doing vendor monitoring and control. And then finally, in the O&M phase, we can do staffing assessments of a portfolio of projects to help provide an independent view of whether the right staffing levels are being applied, whether they're too high or too low. So now let's go into each lane of activity in more detail, and we'll start with price evaluations. So there are 3 steps in our price evaluations of vendor bids. So the very important first step is to develop an independent should-cost estimate, and that may involve an alternatives analysis of different scenarios. But the point is to help the client come up with their own independent estimate, what they think it should cost. And if that's done right, then you've got a really good data point for comparison. Then the second step is to, once the bids come in, to use the SLIM tool, which I'll explain on the next couple of slides, to compare the vendor bids with not only the independent should cost estimate, but also with other historical projects completed in the client environment, as well as industry trend lines. And then the third step is to take a closer look at the vendor bids which appear to be outside reasonable expectations. Are they too high or too low, and what could be the reasons behind that? Does it imply, for example, if the bid is too high, does it imply very low productivity, or that the vendor may be overly padding their estimate? Or if the bid is too low, does it imply overly optimistic productivity, or is the vendor trying to lowball their way in the door? So those are important things to try to look at. The next slide is an overview of our SLIM tool. It stands for the Software Lifecycle Management Tool. And this is it's a parametric estimation tool that uses math, uses algorithms along with historical data to come up with estimates of software development projects. And so the key inputs are the size of the software functionality, as well as process productivity. And then you can also put in constraints if you have any, and it can look at the probability of meeting those constraints. So for the size of the functionality, there are multiple ways to measure that, and we can work with all of those different methods. So some of the common methods are number of Agile user stories, number of function points, number of lines of code, number of requirements, number of objects. So we have a method at QSM of translating all of these to a common sizing unit that we call an implementation unit. And we can do that also for ERP projects. We translate the number of configurations into a size and implementation units. So we quantify the size, and then for process productivity, what we usually do is we start with an assumed assumed productivity based on an industry trend line or on historical productivity within the client environment. And then we can adjust the productivity assumption up or down if necessary based on differences in methods, tools, technical complexity, and personnel profile. For example, if you know the project is going to have a very junior team working on it, or if it's more complex than the typical project in the client environment, then we may make some adjustments, adjust the productivity down from the original starting point. So then the output of the SLIM tool is you have an estimate of the staffing curve, the cost, the schedule, a prediction of defects, as well as the probability of meeting key constraints. So this is very helpful in doing an independent estimate for the client, but then also when we receive bids from vendors, we can reconstruct them in the SLIM tool to see what level of productivity is implied by the bid that they've submitted. And here's an example scenario with SLIM. And again, as I mentioned, it allows you to create what-if scenarios very quickly, which is really helpful in that first phase when you're deciding whether to do a project and maybe thinking about what approach you want to take. For example, you may want to look at various alternatives, doing a legacy enhancement, doing new custom development, doing a package implementation, or some combination. So we can look at different assumptions. And then also you may run different scenarios where you look at doing all the functionality in one big release, or maybe you do it in multiple releases, things like that. So here on this next slide is an example reconstruction of two vendor bids. So here we're comparing them versus an independent estimate, which the independent estimate is the red square you see there on the against the blue trend line. Then the blue trend line represents an industry trend line for this type of software, and then the gray dots represent historical projects within the client environment. And here we're comparing the size of the functionality versus effort and cost. So it's important to be aware of vendor bids that are too high or too low versus this historical data. So the bid for vendor number 1, as you can see, is more than a standard deviation higher than average. This dotted line represents one standard deviation above the average line. And that implies either very low productivity or they're overly padding their estimate. So you want to really take a careful look at that one. And vendor 2, the other one, is the opposite. It's well over a standard deviation below average, which either implies very optimistic productivity or they're trying to lowball in order to win the work. And it's important to note that some of these vendors have very clever ways of getting additional funding via change orders. So the client really ends up paying just as much and often more than they would otherwise. So the next lane is technical evaluations of vendor bids. And there are several myths associated with technical evaluations of vendors, and maybe you've experienced some of these. Myth number 1, an evaluation of the vendor's technical and management approach accurately assesses their ability to perform. That may seem reasonable on the surface, but in reality, this type of technical evaluation really assesses the skill of the proposal writer, not the development team. And in fact, the proposal writer is probably not even a key person on the delivery team. And for some vendors, they're not even an employee of the company. They've hired someone to help write the proposal. And while there's nothing wrong, with this, with vendors doing this to write a good proposal, it's not necessarily a good measure of, what type of delivery you're going to get. The second myth is that the technical evaluation panel is always made up of individuals with the right technical skills, tools, and project metrics to perform a robust, objective analysis. The reality is, in many organizations, and certainly in my observations, it often consists of whoever is available, and they don't necessarily have the tools, the skills, or the project metrics to do a proper assessment. The third myth is that there's a positive correlation between high subjective technical evaluation scores and actual vendor performance. Based on anecdotal data, this is very doubtful, but all organizations should measure statistically how their vendor evaluation processes are working. When you look at the scores, how did that vendor actually perform? Our solution and our recommendation is to use quantitative criteria to make the technical evaluation process more objective. And we do this through assessments of past performance. So there are two primary steps in our process. The first is to assess vendor past performance versus industry trend lines, as well as historical performance of other vendors in the client environment. Then step two is also taking a look at the vendor's staffing plan. Are the proposed staffing levels reasonable versus industry or client history? And does the staff buildup plan ensure resources are rolled on only when needed to minimize idle time? And it's important to note that step two is particularly important in government organizations and any other organization where the price and technical evaluation teams are not allowed to share information. Some organizations do this because they want an independent assessment of price and technical. And while there certainly can be some important reasons to do that, there are also downsides because the teams don't have visibility into the complete picture. So without access to the price proposal, doing a staffing assessment is one of the only ways that the technical evaluation panel can see whether staffing levels are reasonable versus the amount of required functionality and other constraints. So from our research of thousands of projects, we found that vendor past performance is the best indicator of future success, far better than looking at, reading a technical or management approach. So what we do as part of the RFP is we ask vendors to provide a few key metrics on their historical past performance projects. For software development and enhancement projects, we ask for the following metrics on a per project basis. The size of the functionalities delivered, staffing, effort, and/or cost, schedule duration, and then defects discovered both pre and post delivery. So we ask for that for each project that they submit as a past performance qualification. And then if we're talking about a contract for O&M sustainment, then we ask for similar metrics but a little bit different. We're looking at metrics based on performance on an annual basis. How much functionality was maintained in an O&M environment? What were the staffing levels? How many trouble tickets were closed, total and by priority and severity? And what was the average age of trouble tickets by priority and severity? And it certainly also is valuable in this case, for vendors to comment on maybe how difficult the portfolio was that they inherited maybe from another vendor, because that certainly, factors in. The important thing is that numbers and data are apolitical. They don't have feelings or other motives. It's objective data that can be very helpful. So this next slide shows an example scorecard that can be used to assess the vendor's past performance. If the metrics provided are incomplete, poor quality, cannot be verified, or otherwise non-existent, the vendor would be assessed as high risk and rated unsatisfactory in this example. If, on the other hand, metrics are satisfactory, in other words, the vendor can provide metrics, then you have some quantitative data to do a proper assessment versus industry trend lines and client history. So then you can look at those vendors and see how they compare. So if productivity is below average versus the comparison data set, then the vendor might be rated marginal, for example. But if the productivity is average or above average, you obviously would rate them better. But if the proposed key personnel did not work on the past performance projects, then there would still be some risk. We would assess it at a medium risk and maybe rate the vendor acceptable. The vendor may be a good company with lots of previous success, but it's important to note that they may be hiring staff for your project from off the street, and those personnel it may take them some time to get up to speed on company processes, so there's no guarantee the performance will be the same as their past performance. So that's why if you get vendors that have productivity that's average or above average, and they're proposing key personnel that worked on the past performance projects that they're providing, well, then you have a lower risk and more confidence that you'll get the same level of performance. So in those cases, if their productivity is average and you're getting key personnel on those projects, you might rate them above acceptable. And if their productivity is above average and you're getting some of the same people, then you might rate them outstanding. So this is one way to more objectively assess past performance. So the next slide just dives into this in a little bit more detail so you can see how some of this is done. So here's an example vendor and an example comparison of past performance versus a trend line from industry, or this could be from the client organization. The red triangles here represent historical past performance projects submitted by the vendor. On this chart, we're looking at the size of the functionality versus speed of delivery. And you can see here that most of the vendors' past performance projects took longer than average in schedule duration. On the next slide here, this is comparing, doing a similar comparison but with effort. So you can see the effort expended is pretty consistently higher than average. And then here, this next slide is looking at quality, so number of defects discovered during systems integration testing. And you can see here, defects are above average as well. Now, it's important here to take this with a little bit of a grain of salt, because this could mean that there are more defects in their development process because maybe they didn't build quality into earlier phases. But it could also mean that they're really thorough in their testing phases, and they simply are finding more defects by doing more thorough testing. So the complete picture comes when you look at post-delivery defects, as well. So then you can see whether defects are high because of thoroughness or because of poorer quality software. So a few summary observations just based on these example slides. This vendor, certainly on the positive side, they were able to provide past performance metrics, and they have some consistency with their data, no extreme outliers, so it looks like they have a stable process. But of course, a little bit on the downside is they have below average productivity, and in both speed of delivery, effort efficiency, and it appears that maybe quality as well. So you might score this vendor somewhere between marginal and acceptable as an example. All right, so this next slide moves on to step 2 of the technical evaluation, where we assess the reasonableness of the vendor's staffing plan. In the 1960s, a gentleman named Peter Norden found that engineering project staffing could be described by a Rayleigh curve, which you see at the top of the slide here. Our founder, QSM's founder, Larry Putnam Sr., applied these principles to software projects. And what he found, and what we've continued to find in researching thousands of projects, is that this is a good representation of how projects are really executed. How people are, how staff members provide productive contributions to the delivery effort. And what we found is that level load staffing, in contrast, results in significant wasted effort due to staff who are idle at the beginning of the project as well as the end. Why is this the case? Well, the reason is that, and the reason the Rayleigh curve is a good model of how software development and other engineering design intensive projects execute, it has to do with task dependencies. At the beginning of a project, there are typically a small number of initial tasks that need to be completed before a larger number of dependent tasks can begin. And then, of course, there's an even larger number of dependent tasks that are dependent on that next layer of tasks. And sometimes there are dependencies, sometimes there aren't. But when you look at an entire project, in most cases, it's not possible for a team of 50 or 100 people to be productive from day one. Typically, you have a smaller number of people that have to complete a few key tasks, and then you can gradually get everyone productive on tasks. So the Rayleigh curve more accurately represents how this actually plays out. So if you have a vendor that's proposing, level load staff, especially a high number of staff from day one, it's highly likely that that's going to be wasted money and you're going to have idle staff. So definitely something to look carefully at. So in summary, you want to assess the reasonableness of staffing versus industry trend lines and client history, and also take a careful look at the vendor's planned staffing buildup. Does it make sense? Do they seem to be applying staff when they're needed, or on the other hand, are they giving you a standing army that you're going to have to pay for, who are not necessarily productive? All right, so the next lane of activity applies to post-award. So after you've awarded a vendor contract and now the project is underway, what can you do to increase the probability of success? So this lane is very important because no vendor selection process is perfect, and projects can easily get off track for a variety of reasons that may or may not be within the vendor's control. So looking at this slide here, we have some status metrics that we typically look at, and this is a view from our SLIM control tool. What you see here is, the metrics on the left are not unique. Many organizations track costs and schedule and even staffing. But what makes our approach unique is the metrics on the right. These are forward-looking metrics based on product construction and defects. These metrics often tell the true story of project status, and they're much more difficult to fudge. With some determination, you can find out how much code has been developed and unit tested, for example, going into a configuration management system. You can, same thing with defects. You can go into the defect tracking database and see how many defects have been discovered over time and by severity. Whereas on the left side, certainly with schedule milestones and tasks, those can be fudged a little bit. It can be subjective when tasks are completed and what percentage complete you are. And of course, the consumption of costs and staffing is more backward looking on what's been consumed to date. So in this example, the red line represents expected progress in our SLIM control tool versus actuals. So you can see here on the upper right, product construction is clearly behind schedule. And then also below that, defect levels are higher than expected and have not yet passed the peak of what we would expect. If we only looked at the metrics on the left, let's say ignoring the ones on the right, it looks like everything's green, everything's on track. But in reality, it's not. And we've seen in many cases where these metrics on the right have been a very powerful indicator of where the project truly is. And I'll provide a couple of real examples. So this first one is from one of our case studies. Product construction on this mission-critical system kept falling further and further off track. And every time we tried to give the vendor the benefit of the doubt as far as how much progress had been made. So in other words, if there was any doubt, we gave them more credit versus less credit for actual product construction. You can see here, kept getting further and further off track, and we ended up forecasting a schedule delay of almost 2 years. So this quantitative data gave our client the courage to cancel this contract and replan, saving taxpayers $30 million. Before applying these quantitative methods, our client already had a gut feeling that things weren't going well, and they had some other project management consultants that were, kind of telling them things anecdotally. But it was the quantitative data that really, gave our client the courage to actually, make a decision on, on this particular project. So the next slide is another example where we looked at defect data. So this is also a real example and also a very high visibility project that was in the testing phases, right in the middle of systems integration testing. A huge system, and this was an ERP project that was actually integrating several systems. And so we used defect metrics to forecast the likely delivery date. We found from our research of hundreds of projects that defects typically follow a Rayleigh curve, and that there's a gradual reduction of defects discovered as the software becomes more stable. It's very unusual for a project to have a huge number of defects discovered in 1 month, and then they suddenly burn all of them down and close them, and then the software is stable and everything's great. It usually doesn't work that way. If a project is discovering over 200 defects, as you see on this slide, in a given month, it's not ready for delivery, and it's very unlikely that the very next month is going to only have 5 defects. It's probably going to be a gradual burn down. So with this, as this chart indicates, the defect levels are far above what we would consider acceptable for delivery. For business systems, we recommend a defect discovery rate of less than 20 defects per month, and this was well over 10 times that number. So with this data, we urged the program office to postpone their go live date significantly. Sadly, they ignored our advice, unlike the previous client on the previous slide who had the courage to do the right thing, even though it was hard. In this case, the program office ignored our advice, and they forced the scheduled go-live date. They said, we're going to meet this date no matter what, and the project was a complete train wreck, a very visible failure at the highest executive levels. The project was canceled altogether, and each of the stakeholder organizations had to come up with their own solution. And needless to say, they were not happy. So in summary, in order to do this type of quantitative monitoring control, you need to have the vendors provide some metrics as part of their regular status reports. And it's not very onerous. We're just asking for some basic metrics that are a byproduct of the software development process. So if it's a development or enhancement project, we're looking for the amount of functionality developed and unit tested, thus far, staffing, and effort expenditures, and even just staffing is fine to get a sense of how many people are working on the project. Milestone completion and defects discovered, both pre and post delivery. For software sustainment, we're looking at the size of the functionality maintained, staffing levels applied, and then here you're looking at number of trouble tickets opened and closed, as well as the average age of trouble tickets. Now, if it's a portfolio of projects, it may be a combination of sustainment and enhancements. So we would look for data in both areas. So in order to get this data, it's important to write it into the RFP, the request for proposal, and make it part of the contract. And that way they can easily be collected on a routine basis as part of a normal vendor status report. So there's no pain involved or very little because, again, this is a byproduct of normal software development. All right, so the final lane of activity that we have with our vendor management solution is staffing assessment on IT outsourcing contracts. And what we can do is we can model an entire portfolio of projects and identify opportunities for savings. In this example, from a real client case study, we found an opportunity to save an average of $1 million per project simply by highlighting, in this case, the 12 projects that were grossly overstaffed, and basically coming up with a rule that you won't allow staffing levels above a certain level for a given amount of functionality. So in other words, just by replaying this portfolio and having those 12 overstaffed projects use average staffing, you could easily save an average of $1 million per project. So, and we also discovered here that projects that use smaller teams, some of them were able actually to deliver faster than average. So it sometimes, it may not seem intuitive, but sometimes overstaffing actually causes projects to take longer because you have more people touching the design and the code. So we can do this type of analysis for a whole portfolio and help save a lot of money. All right, so here are some just a couple of case study examples from real clients. So the first is one, a client where at the beginning, when we first started working with them, they felt like they were they're really frustrated. They felt like they were in a weak negotiating position with their vendors. They felt like they had no real way to provide an independent estimate. In fact, one of our clients joked with us that he would whisper over to the vendors, how much do you think this should cost? And that became the independent estimate. And you'd be surprised at how often that happens. They had no real capability to do a true independent estimate. And they're unsure of whether their staffing levels were appropriate, whether they're paying too much or too little, and often had troubled projects that were late or over budget or didn't meet expectations. So what we did in working with them is we provided a comprehensive solution. We helped them collect historical data on past performance projects. We provided acquisition support for future projects and helped provide independent estimates. We helped do the tracking and controlling of projects once they were underway. And then also we did other special analyses of project team size, portfolio budgeting, vendor productivity, release strategy, et cetera. So just a couple of examples. The first bullet here is actually the slide I already presented. It was the high visibility project that they were able to terminate and save $30 million that they would have spent and to replan. Secondly, they had a portfolio of projects and we helped them model a more appropriate staffing level where they could still achieve the same amount of functionality with very little schedule penalty. And so they've reduced their staff from 100 to 52, saving $8 million, 12 million, saving $12 million per year. And this was a couple of years ago, and this portfolio has been doing just fine at the reduced cost of still delivering, on a regular schedule, and the savings, come in every year. And then also for many other projects, we've saved at least another 25 million. So big success story, and the CIO of this organization, as well as the deputy and the head of the program management office, are very pleased with how this solution has played out. Here's another example, a smaller example of how just applying these techniques, to one project can make a difference. This was a client that, they had a mission critical project, and to redevelop a loan examination review tool, and they were kind of uneasy, when they got a bid from one of their existing vendors. It just didn't feel right. It kind of felt like they thought it might be too high, but they had no way to really independently verify that. So we went in and we used a method called function point analysis to do an independent size estimate, and then we did an independent estimate in SLIM, and then we modeled their bid and compared it with a sample of similar projects from our benchmark database. And so in doing that analysis, we found that the vendor bid indeed was too high, and had plenty of quantitative evidence supporting that. And so we proposed an alternative plan that reduced costs by $600K. So that was just on one medium-sized project. Here's another slide that just is an example of just the advantages of using the SLIM tool to improve the estimation process. Whether you're doing it for vendor management or just for internal development. So you can see here after just a few years of using SLIM, the percent of projects over budget and schedule and the number of dollars out of financial control went way down. Very positive results. And this particular client case study was written up in Larry Putnam Sr.'s book entitled 5 Core Metrics. So that concludes the main presentation. I think there's plenty of time to take some questions if you have any.
Thanks, Joe. And just to make everybody aware, we will have a replay available. So if you came in late or want to share this with anybody, I'll send the link to that replay out early next week. So just to start out, one question that we got was, do we need to apply all the techniques you outlined in the presentation?
Yeah, and certainly you get the best, most bang for the buck by applying all of them, across the portfolio. But no, you certainly can get a lot of value just by applying one of the techniques. Even just doing an independent estimate, if that's the only thing that you do, that can be very valuable. Or just doing the vendor monitoring and control. Maybe the contracts have already been awarded, and you simply want to get a sense of the health of how things are going. Just applying that technique can be very powerful oversight technique to get a sense of what's going on.
How do you handle a situation where vendors say they aren't contractually required to provide the metrics data and want to charge us extra for it?
Well, I think first, as I mentioned earlier, these metrics that we're asking for are a normal byproduct of software development. So if the vendor has any level of process maturity, these are measures that they should have and should be tracking. But the best way, the easiest way to ensure you can get these metrics is by writing it into the RFP. But if the contract's already been awarded, then it may just be a matter of sitting down with the vendor and saying, look, we need to get more visibility into what's going on, and hopefully a vendor that values their reputation and wants future business will work with you to come up with these, because they're not very onerous, and it shouldn't cost a lot of effort on their part. And in some cases where a vendor has immature processes, we've even come in and kind of helped the vendor, figure out the best way to collect these metrics. So we can certainly do that as well, and that sometimes is the right approach. Maybe when a long-term contract has already been awarded to a vendor, so you don't have the option of recompeting the work, or maybe for other reasons, the client really likes the vendor, and so we can help them come up with a process for collecting and reporting the right metrics.
What if the metrics data provided by the vendor is poor quality, incomplete, or cannot be verified?
Well, that's definitely a challenge, and certainly if you're assessing vendor bids, and you have some vendors that are like that, and others that submit high quality metrics, well, that may be part of your selection process. But if we're talking about poor quality metrics that are being submitted while a project is underway, so after a project, a contract has been awarded, well then, we've got some good techniques for validating and normalizing data, and we can actually do some, surprisingly good analyses even on incomplete, metrics. Because we've been doing this for so long, we can get a good sense of what's going on. So, there, some of what we might do is just see what, for what data we do have, what does that look like? But then how can we get better data? And sometimes it might mean, as I mentioned earlier, working with the vendor to help them clearly understand what we're looking for and help them improve their metrics gathering and status reporting.
If I'm a vendor, why should I provide metrics data that might get used against me?
That's definitely a good question. Well, I think you definitely want to give your client confidence that that the project is on track, if it is, and if it's off track, it's better to give them an early warning than to have surprises at the end of the project. If there's early warning, in many cases a client, it's less painful for them to maybe reschedule, follow on deployment activities, and also reset stakeholder expectations of when the functionality might be available, or you can work with them to proactively maybe replan the highest priority functionality, so you still get the mission critical stuff done on time, but you postpone maybe some lower priority functionality. But it's definitely better to have proactive warnings that things might be a little bit off track than to have a surprise at the last minute. Like that one example I presented, where right up till the 11th hour, the vendor and the program office were trying to force a go live date, even though the software wasn't close to being ready, and everyone expecting to get the software. All those expectations were set, and there are posters being put up everywhere, getting everyone ready to use this new system, and then it was a huge, very visible letdown, for everyone. I think if the vendor values their reputation and relationship with the client, I think most will see that it's better to provide some transparency and visibility into what's going on, and to work together to see whether things are on track or not.
How much does it cost to implement the vendor management solution, and what is the return on investment?
So to get started in a small way, just jumping to the case studies that I presented, and I'll just use those as an easy example. So the second one that I presented, where it was just a single project, This client, I believe, got a single-seat tool license of Slim, and they hired us for about maybe $25K in consulting, fees, and we saved them $600,000. So that's a pretty substantial return on investment by most, most standards. And then this larger case study, this started out, our client hired us initially for about $100K to do a proof of concept, and then later, once they saw the value, had us apply the techniques to their entire portfolio. So this is a larger engagement that's about $2 million a year in consulting fees, but we've saved this client over $100 million, and definitely ROI at least in 25 times probably the cumulative amount that they've spent. And this client organization, just to give you an idea, they have an overall IT portfolio of about $280 million, but we started working in one division that spends about $60 million a year in software development projects. So hopefully that can provide a couple of examples. But in every case where we've applied this, there's been a very high return on investment, and it's relatively easy to measure with these techniques.
I think we have time for just a couple more questions. So one of the last ones is, what if you have a vendor from a startup and they don't have very much historical data?
Well, that's definitely, can be a challenging situation, when, of course, when you want to try to use vendor past performance, to do an evaluation, and they don't have any past performance. So you can still work with that. You just have to be aware of and quantify the risk that you're dealing with. So hopefully, maybe in some cases a startup company might have a little bit of past performance. Maybe it's 1 or 2 projects. Or if they don't have any, well, then you just build that risk into your plans. Maybe there are other reasons why you really want to do business with this vendor. Maybe they're offering a very creative and innovative solution. Maybe you just want to try them out on one project. So in the independent estimate, you just account for that additional risk. You maybe get a little more conservative with the productivity assumptions, for example. But then, most importantly, you measure the results at the end of that project and look at, okay, did this work out? How did this vendor do? If they do really well, then you may want to give them some more business. Or if the project doesn't go very well, then you have some quantitative measures we'll see how it compared to other projects. So you can definitely work with that, and also if they're a startup company, maybe they need some help coming up with regular status measures. So as I mentioned earlier, that's something we can definitely help with.
I think that we're good I think we're coming to the end right now, and if you guys have any additional questions, please feel free to contact us at info@qsm.com, and look forward to future webinars from QSM. Thank you, Joe, for this presentation today.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks everyone for your time. I hope this was valuable.